What does it take to step into the promises God has for you, even when the road ahead looks impossible? In today's episode, we journey through Joshua, the book of bold leadership, courage, and conquering God's promises. From the miraculous crossing of the Jordan River to the fall of Jericho, Joshua's story is filled with moments of faith, trust, and divine victory. How can we apply the lessons from this incredible conquest to our own struggles and triumphs? Let's dive into the adventure of following God's call with unwavering courage.
All right, so picture this. You've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years.
40 years.
And suddenly you're like right there on the edge of the promised land.
Wow.
That's where we're picking up with the book of Joshua.
Yeah.
And trust me, there is way more to this book than just battle stories.
Oh, absolutely.
We're going to be exploring excerpts from a document called Joshua, Courageous Faith and God's Fulfilled Promises.pdf.
Okay.
And I am so ready to dive in.
Me too. I think what's so fascinating about the book of Joshua is that it's a historical narrative.
Right.
But Joshua's journey really speaks to, like, the challenges we face today, doubts.
Oh, yeah.
Tough decisions, needing that strength to just move forward.
For sure.
It's packed with practical wisdom and reassurance about God's faithfulness even when things get tough.
Absolutely. And speaking of challenges, can you imagine the pressure on this guy, Joshua,
Oh my goodness.
taking over from Moses? I mean,
Huge shoes to fill.
talk about a legacy to live up to, leading a nation into uncharted territory, facing enemies left and right.
And that's exactly why I think we see that phrase repeated over and over in the book, be strong and courageous.
Yeah.
And it's not just a pep talk.
Right.
It's a direct command from God.
It's powerful.
Mhm.
And it makes me think about all the times we feel totally inadequate for what we're facing.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever felt that way, like in over your head?
All the time, constantly.
I think we all have at some point.
And theologically, it's really interesting how Joshua's story kind of illustrates this idea of God's strength being made perfect in our weakness. It's not about us mustering up, like, superhuman strength.
Right.
It's about acknowledging our limitations and relying on God's power to work through us.
I love that. And we see that play out in different instances throughout the book.
We do, yeah.
Like that whole crossing of the Jordan River.
Oh, yes.
Talk about a seemingly impossible obstacle.
I mean, a massive river standing between them and the promised land.
It's huge, right?
And what does God tell Joshua to do?
Yeah, what does he say?
Have the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant just step right into the rushing waters.
Oh,
And what happens?
I mean, come on, you know the story.
The river stops flowing,
It's incredible.
allowing the entire nation to cross on dry ground.
Like what?
It's a powerful image of God's presence and power at work.
It really is. It wasn't just some magic trick.
No,
It was a divine act.
a sign.
It makes you think about our own Jordan rivers in life, right?
Right.
The situations where we need to maybe just let go of control and trust in God's plan, even when it doesn't make sense.
Absolutely. It really begs the question, what are those things in our lives that require that leap of faith?
Yeah, good question. Then we got the story of Jericho.
Oh, yeah.
Another example of how crazy obedience can lead to incredible outcomes.
I mean, marching around a city blowing trumpets.
I know, you gotta admit, it sounds a little out there.
It does sound a little crazy, but they followed God's instructions no matter how strange they seemed.
Yeah.
And those walls, those impenetrable walls of Jericho,
Yeah,
they crumbled.
I love that story. It underscores this idea that God's ways are not always our ways.
Right.
And sometimes surrender and obedience, even when it feels ridiculous, can lead to major breakthrough.
Totally. But then we have the story of Ai.
Oh yeah, right on the heels of Jericho.
Yeah, and this time it's a different story. Things took a turn.
Things went south.
Yeah, and the defeat what came from one man's disobedience.
Achan, right.
Achan, yeah.
Hiding some of the loot, even though God said destroy everything.
And that one act of disobedience,
The one guy, come on.
it had huge consequences.
It did.
It led to the downfall of the whole nation.
It's a reminder that our choices, even the ones that seem small, can have big ripple effects.
Absolutely.
It makes you think about the choices we make every day and how they might impact not just us, but the people around us too.
For sure. And this all ties into this bigger theme of the covenant that runs through the whole book.
Right.
Israel agreed to follow God's laws.
And in return.
God promised blessings and protection.
And that obedience wasn't just about following the rules, it was about
Trust.
trusting God.
Yeah.
And that trust paved the way for some pretty amazing blessings. Like the division of the land among the 12 tribes
Oh, yeah, that was huge.
is a concrete sign of God keeping his promises.
Exactly. God showing up and saying, I'm faithful to my word.
It's powerful, and it makes you think about those times when we forget about God's promises, when we lose sight of his faithfulness, especially when things are tough.
It's easy to do.
It is. And that's where those memorial stones come in.
Oh, yeah, the ones they set up after crossing the Jordan.
They weren't just decorations.
No.
They were reminders
Of God's miraculous intervention in their lives.
of what he had done.
It's a good question for all of us. How do we keep those moments when we see God's help so clearly, those aha moments? How do we keep those alive in our own lives? How do we not let them fade away?
And the book of Joshua actually gives us a practical answer.
Okay, I'm listening.
The practice of covenant renewals.
Okay, so they would basically...
Hit the refresh button on their commitment to God and his commands.
Yeah, they were intentionally realigning themselves with God's purpose.
It's like a spiritual tune-up.
Yeah, a way to stay grounded, even after experiencing victories.
Because even after you win, you can get complacent.
Exactly. We can forget what got us there.
And then we have Caleb.
Caleb, what a guy.
85 years old.
85.
And still ready to fight for his inheritance.
I know, such an inspiration.
He's a testament that God isn't limited by our age or our limitations.
Not at all. And what's so interesting is that even Caleb, this faithful warrior who had seen God do amazing things,
Right.
even he needed reassurance sometimes.
Yeah.
God had to tell him, I will be with you.
It's a beautiful reminder that even the strongest among us can struggle with doubt and fear.
For sure. But God's presence is always there.
Always. It's a constant. And it makes me think about those times when we might feel like our best days are behind us.
Yeah, when we're facing setbacks and challenges.
When we question our purpose and our ability to move forward.
Yeah, those are tough times.
They are, but Caleb's story is like a giant, nope, not over yet sign.
It really underscores that God's not done with us, no matter our age or what we've been through.
And Caleb's story also highlights a really important transition that's happening in the book.
Oh yeah, the passing of the torch from Moses to Joshua.
It's a beautiful picture of God raising up new leaders when they're needed.
Equipping them to carry on his work.
And if we zoom out a little and look at the whole Bible,
Yeah, the big picture.
this transition actually points us toward Jesus,
The ultimate leader.
the one who guides us into the fullness of God's promises.
It's a reminder that God is always working,
Always.
orchestrating his plan through generations.
And he provides the leaders we need for every season.
That's right. God really does prepare his people, doesn't he, for what he calls them to.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And in Joshua, we see this beautiful blend of courage, obedience, and God's faithfulness.
Wholly woven together.
It's like each story builds on the one before it, revealing deeper layers of God's character and how he interacts with his people.
It's a beautiful progression. And, it reminds me that the Promised Land wasn't just about a physical place.
Right.
It was about a way of being a life lived in harmony with God, experiencing all of his blessings and provision.
That's such a great point. It shifts the focus from outward conquest to an inward transformation, aligning our hearts and lives with God's will.
And that's a pursuit that still resonates with us today.
It does.
I mean, we may not be facing literal armies
No.
or conquering physical territories,
Right.
but we all have our own Jerichos.
We do.
Those obstacles that seem impossible to overcome.
Yeah, those areas in our lives where we feel stuck or defeated.
Totally. Whether it's a relationship that's struggling, a financial hardship,
Yeah.
or some deep-seated fear that's holding us back.
We've all got those walls that seem impossible to break down.
And Joshua's story gives us a roadmap,
It does.
a source of encouragement and practical wisdom for facing those challenges.
It reminds us that with courage and trust in God, even the toughest walls can crumble.
It's a message of hope, for sure. So how can we apply these lessons from Joshua to our lives today?
Good question. What are some tangible steps we can take?
Yeah.
Well, first, I think we need to identify our own Jerichos. What are those areas where we feel blocked, where we sense a disconnect from God's promises?
Once we've pinpointed those obstacles, then what?
Then we can start to strategize.
Strategize. I love that word.
Me
It
too.
reminds me of how Joshua sent spies into Jericho
Yes.
to gather intel before making a move.
It was smart.
It wasn't just blind faith.
No, it was faith combined with action.
Right, and that's where things get real for us too, Seeking wise counsel from people we trust, praying for guidance, and taking practical steps to address the situation.
Aligning our actions with our faith.
It's about embracing both the spiritual and the practical.
Like those Israelites marching around Jericho.
It might have seemed crazy, but they obeyed and they saw a breakthrough.
Sometimes God's guidance might lead us down paths that don't make sense at first.
Right.
But we have to trust that he sees the bigger picture
Even when we don't.
even when we don't.
So it's about surrendering our limited understanding.
Yeah.
And being open to the possibility that God might call us to do things that seem unconventional.
Or even illogical.
Yeah, and that takes courage.
It does.
The courage to trust God even when it challenges our comfort zones.
And as we've seen in Joshua, obedience, even when it's tough, often leads to amazing results.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that courage isn't the absence of fear.
Right.
It's about choosing to trust God even when we're afraid.
It's about acknowledging our fear, but not letting it control us.
Right.
It's about leaning into God's strength, knowing that his power is made perfect in our weakness.
So even if someone's feeling overwhelmed by their own Jericho,
Yeah.
feeling inadequate or afraid, they can still find the courage to take those first steps
Yeah.
by drawing on God's strength.
It's not about mustering up our own strength.
Right.
It's about tapping into the unlimited power that comes from our relationship with God.
And just like God was with Joshua every step of the way,
Guiding him, providing for him.
He's with us too.
We're not alone in our battles.
We have a God who's fighting for us.
A God who wants us to win.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not isolated in our struggles.
We have a God who's both mighty and compassionate.
Yeah, he's walking with us through it all.
And it's important to remember that victory might not always look the way we expect it to.
Right.
You know, the Promised Land wasn't just about outward conquest.
Right.
It was about entering into that place of peace and provision with God.
Experiencing the fullness of his blessings. So even if our circumstances don't change overnight,
Yeah,
we can still experience victory
you can.
by drawing closer to God, finding our peace and security in him.
And letting his presence transform us from the inside out.
That's a victory worth pursuing. So as we wrap up this part of our conversation, what's the one key message from Joshua's story that you hope listeners will take away?
That's a good question. There's so much, but if I had to pick one,
Yeah.
I'd say it's this: never underestimate the power of courage and trusting God, no matter how impossible your Jericho might seem.
I love that.
Even the strongest walls can come down when we dare to believe and step out in faith.
That's a powerful reminder for all of us who are facing our own giants.
It is.
Those obstacles that make us question our strength and God's faithfulness.
You know, in the end, Joshua's story is really a reflection of our own stories. It's a story of human weakness meeting divine strength.
Yeah.
Fear being overcome by faith.
And seemingly impossible obstacles being conquered by God's power.
Working in and through us.
It's an invitation to embrace the adventure of faith.
Knowing that we have a God who's bigger than any challenge we face.
Beautifully said. Now, for those who are feeling inspired to dig deeper into Joshua's story, what resources would you recommend?
Where can they go to continue this exploration?
We've been talking about the inspiring parts of Joshua's story. You know, the courage and the faithfulness.
Yeah, the victories.
But there are parts of it that are hard to understand.
Parts that are tough to reconcile with our idea of God.
Exactly. Like the conquest of Canaan.
Oh, yeah.
God commanding the Israelites to wipe out entire cities.
Including women and children.
It's brutal, honestly.
Yeah.
It's hard to square that with a loving God.
That's one of the most challenging parts of the book.
It is.
And it's something that people have wrestled with for centuries.
So how do we even approach a topic like that?
Well, it's important to remember the historical context.
Okay.
The Canaanites were involved in practices that were considered really bad in the ancient world.
Like what?
Child sacrifice, idolatry, things like that.
So from a biblical perspective.
God's judgment was a response to that wickedness.
But even so, the level of violence is still hard to comprehend.
It is, and it forces us to look at the complex nature of God.
Okay.
He is both just and merciful, righteous and compassionate.
It's a tension we see throughout the Bible.
Right? This idea of God's judgment and his mercy existing side by side.
So how do we make sense of that?
It's a tough question, and I don't think there are easy answers.
Yeah.
We have to remember we're looking at this from a human perspective.
Right?
We can't fully grasp God's mind or his plan
It's like trying to understand the ocean.
by looking at a drop of water.
Exactly. We only see a tiny part of the whole picture.
That's right.
So what are some things to keep in mind as we wrestle with these tough parts of the story?
Well, first of all, this is a historical account.
Okay.
It's not a set of instructions for how we should live today.
So we're not supposed to take it as an endorsement of violence
Definitely not.
or genocide.
No, it's a record of events that happened in a certain time and culture.
We can't just ignore the parts of the Bible that make us uncomfortable, though, right?
Absolutely. We need to approach it all with honesty.
And reverence.
Yes. And as we do that,
Yeah.
we might be challenged and even changed by what we discover.
That's the beauty of engaging with the Bible. It's not always easy or comfortable.
No.
But it pushes us to think and to grow.
It's a living word.
It speaks to us in a deep way.
And even in these challenging passages, like the conquest of Canaan, we can still see God's grace and mercy at work.
Like the story of Rahab,
Yes.
the Canaanite woman who helped the Israelite spies.
Her story is amazing.
It is.
It shows how far God's grace reaches.
She trusted in God.
And she and her family were saved.
It's a reminder that God sees beyond appearances,
And his mercy is for everyone who seeks him.
no matter their past.
That's right.
It's a beautiful example of God's power to redeem.
And it's a thread of hope that runs through even the hardest parts of Scripture.
It brings us full circle. Despite the challenges in the book of Joshua,
Yeah.
it ultimately shows us a God who is faithful, powerful, and merciful.
A God who judges sin but also offers grace.
So as we wrap up our look at Joshua, what's the main message you want listeners to take away?
I'd say embrace the journey of faith, even when it takes you through tough places.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to ask questions.
To wrestle with the hard parts.
And to seek understanding.
The Bible invites us to engage with it deeply.
And when we do that,
Yeah.
we encounter a God who's bigger than our doubts
More powerful than our fear.
and more loving than we can imagine.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, you're not alone on this journey.
There's a whole community of people walking this path of faith with you
Asking the same questions.
and seeking God together.
And as we seek Him,
May we find courage in his promises
strength in His presence.
and hope in his unfailing love.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through the book of Joshua.
We hope you'll keep exploring the Bible,
And until next time,
walk in faith, and the unwavering love of God.
Joshua begins with God's command to be strong and courageous as the Israelites prepare to enter the Promised Land. But do we approach life's challenges with the same boldness? Reflect on the times when fear held you back. Are you ready to step into God's promises with faith, despite the obstacles? Remember, God has already given us everything we need to succeed. If you feel inspired to move forward, subscribe, like, and comment. How will you face your giants with faith today? As Joshua leads Israel to victory in battle, we see the power of trusting God in the face of overwhelming odds. But how often do we rely on our own strength, rather than God's? Reflect on your own life. Where are you trusting in your own ability instead of God's power? Remember, the battle is the Lord's. If you're ready to trust God for victory in your life, subscribe, like, and comment. What battles are you giving to God today? Joshua teaches us the importance of obedience to God's commands. But how often do we pick and choose which of God's commands we want to follow? Reflect on areas where you've been hesitant to obey God completely. Are you willing to obey even when it's difficult or uncomfortable? Obedience leads to blessing, and God's ways are always best. If you're ready to live in full obedience, subscribe, like, and comment. Where do you need to obey God more fully? The division of the land in Joshua shows us that God fulfills his promises, even when the path is long. But how often do we lose sight of the promise when we're facing challenges? Reflect on the promises God has made to you. Are you holding on to them, or have you allowed doubt to creep in? Trust that God is faithful to fulfill what he has spoken. If you're clinging to God's promises, subscribe, like, and comment. What promise are you trusting God to fulfill today? In Joshua, the people are reminded to set up stones as a memorial to God's faithfulness. But do we take time to remember God's faithfulness in our own lives? Reflect on moments when God has shown up in powerful ways. Are you taking time to thank him for his provision and guidance? Creating space to remember helps us stay rooted in gratitude. If you're ready to remember God's faithfulness, subscribe, like, and comment. What stones of remembrance can you set up in your life? Joshua also highlights the importance of choosing whom we will serve. The famous declaration, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord," challenges us to make a choice. But how often do we allow the distractions of life to pull us away from God? Reflect on where your loyalty lies. Are you fully committed to serving God, or have other things taken his place? If you're ready to choose God above all else, subscribe, like, and comment. How can you strengthen your commitment to serving God today? The story of Joshua shows that God's plans often require us to take action. But how often do we wait for the perfect circumstances before stepping out in faith? Reflect on how God might be calling you to act, even when the timing doesn't seem ideal. Sometimes, faith requires stepping out before we see the full picture. If you're ready to act in faith, subscribe, like, and comment. What step of faith is God calling you to take today? As Joshua concludes, the people renew their commitment to God's covenant. Reflect on your own commitment to God. Have you fully surrendered every part of your life to Him? The journey of faith is a continual process of renewal and trust. If this message has challenged or inspired you, subscribe, like, and comment. How are you renewing your commitment to God today? Share this message with someone who needs to make a fresh commitment to follow God with their whole heart.